John Dorhauer is the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. For those of you that are not United Church of Christ, that just means he's kind of the head honcho in our denomination nationally. And I had the wonderful privilege of spending 3 days with him just a few weeks ago. And on Sunday, he was welcomed by the Hawaii Conference as our newly installed General Minister and President. And I had the special honor of being the representative from Hawaii to welcome him to Hawaii and acknowledge his installation as our new leader in the United Church of Christ. After that, for the next 2 days, the clergy, all the pastors and ministers of the United Church of Christ all over Hawaii got together with John and listened to him share with all of us what has been on his mind and heart. And one of the things that he shared is that wherever he's gone in the country, he's looking for stories and sharing them about how people are listening to the cries of their neighbors. And he said that's what the church is all about. That's what we should have been doing all along, and some of us do that pretty well. And he said, but moving forward, let's be sure that we're always listening to the cries of our neighbors. Now, I was not surprised at all to hear John say this because I read his most recent book and I know a little bit about him. And as I was thinking about the importance of listening to the cries of our neighbors, I was thinking about what that means for our church here in Koloa. And I'll get to that in just a minute. I want to tell you about what happened at dinner the first night. I was sitting at a table with a whole bunch of other ministers, and one of them, a colleague of mine who I just met since moving back to Hawaii, began sharing with the rest of the people sitting around the table about some of the pain in his life and some of his own tears that he shed. And as we listened to some of his cries, it occurred to me that he was sharing something with us that none of us knew about. His wife had died and 2 of his children had died. And he was deeply, deeply in pain, obviously, over those things. And he cried, he wept bitterly. And I remember thinking, if I hadn't sat down with him and shared this meal, I may never know that about him. And it's so important to be with people and to listen to their cries. And as I thought about what he was sharing with me, it just affirmed what John Dorhauer was telling all of us in Hawaii, which is the same thing he's telling all of the United Church of Christ congregations all over the country. Listen for how people are crying, because they are. What really surprised me, though, is when this colleague of mine went on to tell the story about one of the greatest losses of his life. His first wife just packed up and walked out the door one day and never came back without any explanation. And he was not only in deep pain, but he was angry. And he shared with us that he has never cried over that. He's never been able to cry about one of the most painful things in his life. And it occurred to me that sometimes the cries that we listen for are very loud. They're audible. But some of the cries that people around us are crying are held inside. And I wondered if he was able to cry, if he would, or if it was just more appropriate to hold that kind of pain inside for a time. But as I was thinking about the importance of what John Dorhauer was telling us, it affirmed to me that we must be listening for what we're hearing from the people in our community who are crying, but we also must be listening for what's deep down inside that you just have to be present with in order to hear, because those cries sometimes are not audible at all. We must listen. In today's gospel lesson that Larry read for us just a moment ago, we heard this story, the very well-known story of the Good Samaritan. And in that story, there were 2 people that listened to somebody who was in pain and crying, but then they didn't really listen, did they? They walked on by. And then the 3rd person came along and listened deeply. a Samaritan. He listened carefully. And we don't know if what he heard was audible or silent, but he got close enough and listened carefully enough so that he was moved with compassion. Now, in order to understand this story that we've probably heard many, many times in Sunday school and in church, it's important to look at the background, just as it is for all of the scriptures that we read, so that we can understand what it must have been like for those first hearers that Jesus was telling these things to, and also the first hearers of the gospel. So in order to understand, let me just give you a very brief background. First of all, the man was traveling between Jerusalem and Jericho. That's about 25 miles or so. It would be like one of us walking to Anahola, or almost to Holy Holiday, Martin Sands, or somewhere out that way. It was a long, long walk. And you could make that walk in a day, but you had to be very intentional. And you had to keep focused on walking, or you weren't going to make it until sundown. And walking in the dark in that land in those days was very dangerous because there was not only animals, but there were robbers everywhere. So the man was walking, and he fell down because the robbers attacked him, and we're told that they stripped him of his clothes and took everything that he had. The other thing that we need to know about background before we truly understand the story is the relationship between the Jewish people and Samaritans. So just a little tiny history lesson. About 700 years before Jesus, the great Assyrian army from the north came down to the south and they invaded the Jewish people. And in fact, they were very successful up north where Nazareth was, where Galilee was, where Jesus was from and did a lot of his ministry. The Assyrians came down and they were successful, and they captured and took home with them many of the people, but those who stayed knew who was in charge. The Syrians came all the way down and trying to capture Jerusalem, but they were not successful that time at capturing Jerusalem. So imagine all the people of the north in kind of the middle section of what we now know today as Israel. They're either all gone as captives living in the Assyrian area or in Assyria, or else they're down in the south and they are able to resist the Syrian invaders. To make a long story short, after a time, Assyria let the people go. And so people came down and lived in the northern Israel area, known today primarily as Galilee or near the Lake of Galilee. And then they also came down into that middle section called Samaria. Now the ones who stayed up north decided that they were going to be faithful to all the rules and all the doctrine that they had when they left. So they saw themselves up there north as pure Jews, just like the people who stayed down in Jerusalem did. But in between this great land called Samaria, these people adopted a lot of the culture, a lot of the practices, and some of the religious beliefs of the Assyrians. And the Jewish people from the area of Galilee and from the area of Jerusalem down below, they couldn't stand their neighbors in between. In fact, if I could give you a modern day analogy, think of a sandwich, okay? The Jewish people up north and in the south thought of themselves as wonderful bread, the best baked bread in the world. And yet in the middle of the sandwich was just mud, or worse. They hated the Samaritans with a passion. They couldn't stand them. So it's important for us to realize both the location and the distance of this journey, as well as the relationship between Jews and Samaritans. So in the story, there was a man that was traveling between Jerusalem and Jericho, about 25 miles. And somewhere in that journey, we don't know where, he was attacked by a robber and left for dead. So imagine a guy laying down completely naked over here, all bloody, black and blue, and a priest is on his way on this journey, realizing that he doesn't have a lot of time to spare if he needs to get where he's going to get to before the sun goes down. So he sees this guy over there, and most likely it's one of him. It's another Jewish person in all likelihood. And he sees him, and immediately he turns and doesn't look at the man and walks on the far side of the street like this. And then later on, another priest, a Levite, in other words, a very special priest, comes by and he sees the man, and immediately he turns and goes as far as he can on this side of the street and doesn't look at the man and just keeps on walking. We don't know what the agenda was for the Levite or the priest. We just know that whatever they had to do was much more important than helping that man. The third character comes along. It's the Good Samaritan. And he walks by and he sees this man laying on the ground. And rather than turning away, he turns towards him. And the gospel tells us he walked near. He came near, and he had to get down on his knees in order to do what he did, because the man is laying on the ground. And so he's on his knees and he's bandaging the man. He's helping him. He's tending his wounds. He's pouring wine and he's pouring oil so that he can comfort and heal this man. And then somehow he lifts him up and puts him on his donkey. It says his animal, most likely it was a donkey. And he gets the man on his donkey and takes him to the nearest inn. And we don't know if that's an hour walk or a 3-hour walk. But I'll just tell you, whatever it was not convenient. He takes the man to the inn, knocks on the door, and basically rents a room and cares for the man all night long. In the morning, he realizes he's got to get back to where he's going. So he goes to the innkeeper and says, "The man that I brought in last night, he needs your help. I'm going to give you $200 to take care of him for the next few days. I'm going to go home, I'm going to come back with more money, and whatever it takes for you to make sure this man is okay, I will pay you. Don't worry about the money. You will be repaid." And as we understand the story, that's exactly what happened. So, what's the difference? What really made the difference between the two priests and the Samaritan? Well, it was inconvenient for all three of them. But the two priests went like this. They turned their back on the man. They wouldn't look at him, and they kept going on their journey. They could not be interrupted. The Samaritan, however, rather than turning away, he turned toward the man. And he moved closer to him. And we're told because of that, he had compassion for the man. And that, my friends, is the big difference. When we turn away from people, and we refuse to look at them, and we refuse to hear what they might be crying, we just keep on our journeys, don't we? But when we turn toward the person who's in pain and who might be crying out loud or quietly in absolute silence, and we get down on our knees and we listen and we look, we are moved with compassion. Paloma Union Church is the kind of church that people look at people in pain, and we move toward them and we listen to them. This past week, I met with Judith Foley, who is our outreach chair, and also Missy, who's volunteered to be on the committee. And we talked about how 2017 needs to be a year where we turn toward people in our community and we get close to them and we listen to them. And based on our closeness and our listening and our relationship with them, we will decide how we might be together. It doesn't mean like we're up here because they're poor or they're needy, they're down here. We're in this together because someday we might be them. But we talked about how 2017 needs to be our year where we're focusing on listening to the people who are crying. And just as John Dorhauer said that all over the country people are addressing the needs of people who are crying, there are people in Paloma who are desperately crying because they're hungry, they're in pain, they're lonely, they feel hopeless, they feel helpless. Our job as followers of Jesus is to look at those people, to listen to them, and to move close to them. So we've decided for these 4 weeks to focus on who our neighbors are. And in a couple weeks, you're going to get a little heart in the mail, and we'll have some extras in church for people that aren't getting the mail. But we're going to invite you to write down on your heart some neighbors that you hear crying. And so I'm going to ask you to start listening now for their cries. And when you go to the school or to work or to Big Save or Suyoka's or wherever it is that you do your shopping, and whenever you walk in your neighborhood, I invite you to listen for the cries. Because I promise you there's people out there that you will walk right past if you don't look at them and you don't listen to them. Look at the people around you this week and for the next couple of weeks. Listen to what their cries may be. And in a couple of weeks, you're going to actually write down the kinds of people that you're hearing God telling us, pay attention to these people and help them. You see, the Good Samaritan didn't just have compassion that he kept inside. His compassion flowed out of his heart into his works, and he cared for the person who was wounded, who was beat up by the robbers. He had compassion for that person, and he did something about it. He moved towards him, and he acted upon his compassion. And that's what our job is. And as Debbie Gunning and I, as our stewardship chair, visited over the last couple of months, we don't want to focus on money when it comes to stewardship. We want to focus on people. We want to focus on needs. And yes, we need money to do certain things. But our focus is on the people. God's love for us, God's love for them, and how we might be moved with compassion like the Good Samaritan was moved, because we spend time with people, we move toward them, we look at them, and we listen for their cries. In closing, I want to read just a very short part of our vision statement. This is a vision statement that our church adopted about 1.5 years ago. And we spent the whole year before that just talking about all the possibilities of what might be out there for us, how God might be leading us, where the Spirit might be calling us and inviting us to do. And this is what we came up with 1.5 years ago. I would like for you just to think about these words very carefully for you and what God might be speaking to you as you listen to them. And if it helps you, just close your eyes and take a deep breath and listen to these words. We are known throughout the island for being a church that reaches out to our community and island by spreading God's compassion to people in need. We have ongoing mission and outreach programs in which new people easily become involved. I'm going to read that one more time just so it'll sink in. We are known throughout the island for being a church that reaches out to our community and island by spreading God's compassion to people in need. We have ongoing mission and outreach programs in which new people easily become involved. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for your love and compassion for all people. And as we, as your church, start listening even more carefully to the cries around us, we ask you, oh God, that we would hear those cries and that we would move close to whoever the people are who are crying. And God, because we move close, may our hearts be filled with compassion for them. And God, during this time of discernment for us as a church, we ask that you open our eyes, open our ears, and open our hearts so that we may, in every way possible, show compassion to those people in our community who need something that we have to give. We ask all these things in Jesus' name.